Welcome to ABA on Tap, where our goal is to find the best recipe to brew the smoothest, coldest, and best tasting ABA around. I'm Dan Lowry with Mike Rubio, and join us on our journey as we look back into the ingredients to form the best concoction of ABA on tap. In this podcast, we will talk about the history of the ABA brew, how much to consume to achieve the optimum buzz while not getting too drunk, and the recommended pairings to bring to the table. So without further ado, sit back, relax, and always analyze responsibly.
All right, and welcome back to yet another installment of ABA on Tap. As always, I'm your ever gracious co-host, Mike Rubio, along with Mr. Dan Lowry. Mr. Dan, how are you, sir?
Doing great. Excited about this one. Starts our guest series off.
Our guest series. Super excited. A quick shout out to Suzanne Juswick, our new partner, who has been very busy on the back end, lining up all sorts of guests. And we're super excited for our first guest of the season. Again, kicking off this wave of guests that we're about to host. And we've got Michelle Zeman on today, the Autistic Behavior Analyst on Instagram, also the host of the Safe Space podcast. And I missed the second part of that. It's the Safe Space and ABA podcast. Is that correct?
The ABA podcast.
The ABA
Safe
podcast.
Space, the ABA
That's
podcast.
right. All right. Michelle, it's a pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much for your time. We like to record on Sundays. You're out in beautiful Florida, so we're taking some sunshine time away today on spring forward, daylight savings time, no less. So thank you so much for your time. We're super excited to have you on. Mr. Dan, any preliminary questions you want to kick off with, or do we just step into the origin story?
Yeah, let's just step into the origin story. Let Michelle tell our audience a little bit about herself and go from there, I think is the way to go, Mike.
Yeah. Without further ado, Michelle, tell us about yourself.
All
We like the
right.
origin story. Go as far back as you want,
right.
and I know you've got an interesting story that you've shared with us before, so super excited to get it back out there for our listeners.
Absolutely. Well, hello, everybody. My name is Michelle Zeman, and actually, my story kind of starts when I was very little. So I was diagnosed with pervasive developmental disorder, not other specified, in 1995. So I was 3 years
Recording
old
in
at that.
progress.
So I was 3 years old at that time when I was diagnosed with pervasive developmental disorder, not other specified. And I had actually been told about different types of services. My mom had tried to get into speech therapy for me. And also, even though ABA was not necessarily like popular, it wasn't covered by insurances at all. My mom still tried to get some ABA for me. And so from there, my mom actually hired an autism coach who came in and basically did a parent training model. This autism coach came in, trained my mom on how to implement these goals, and then she was able to work with me on them, and I was able to master them pretty quickly. That took about 6 months. I think we were only enrolled for that long, but I was in speech therapy from kindergarten up until about like 6th or 7th grade, and I had kind of forgotten about those roots until I was a sophomore in college, where I was originally going to be going for my photojournalism degree. I wanted to be a photojournalist. I wanted to work in the newspaper industry. I wanted to, work with a variety of magazines. And then
Well, now you're in the podcasting industry. That's the 2025 version of photojournalism.
Yeah, there you go. Yes.
Since Dan interrupted, I was going to say a newspaper. What's that? I'm kidding. Go ahead.
It's funny because it's true. Anyways, so sophomore year in college, I got reconnected with my old speech therapist who was working at an ABA private clinic, and she was running a social skills group, and I was really interested in volunteering. So from there, I ended up actually volunteering for about a week and a half, and I was like, this is what I want to do. I don't want to do photojournalism. But I also knew that I wanted to finish my degree really quickly.
Okay.
So I finished my photojournalism degree. So I still have a bachelor's in photojournalism, but then I immediately started in my ABA master's degree afterwards, which funny enough, I didn't realize was called ABA. I thought it was called OT for a little while. And I know, I was like, wait, this isn't occupational therapy? No, my mom was actually telling me a little bit about like, hey, this is what it's called. You need to do the research. I looked at it and was like, okay, yes, this is what I want to do. Got into my ABA master's course at Ball State University in 2013. Started in residential, but I started as a direct support professional. Um, Shout out to all the direct support professionals out there. You guys do not get paid enough.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Knowing my roots there. So I got into ABA kind of like in line with direct support professional work, and then transferred to our ABA clinic that was actually on the residential campus. And then from there, I was a therapist there for about a year and a half before deciding to move down to Florida with my mom, where I continued as a behavior technician. And I did that for a little over a year and a half until I passed my board certified behavior analyst exam in 2016.
Okay.
I did direct. Yeah. So I did direct as a BCBA for about 2 years. So my first cycle was dedicated to that. And then my second cycle was when I decided to go into supervision. Moved up to Orlando during my second cycle. And, pretty much ever since then, I've just been like a clinical supervisor. I moved around some companies, became a clinical director at another company, realized how much I hated being a clinical director. And, ever since then, I now have, I've worked remote for the past few years now, actually. And now I'm the director of clinical development through a company in Fairfax, Virginia, where I have my caseload as a BCBA, but then I also work with fieldwork supervisees who want to become a BCBA or a BCABA. And it's been great ever since. And I'm the host of a podcast. So, Safe Space ABA podcast. So yeah, it's been a dream ever since.
That's the whole biopic. You gave us the whole script. We appreciate that. What a great story.
Of course,
Again, what an interesting story. I love the idea here of ABA. What's that? It's called OT, right? So when we talk about collaborative treatment and things like that, and it's important to think about how similar, from a developmental perspective, any of those activities are going to look, and then the nuances that differentiate the content expertise that an occupational therapist has versus what we carry, which doesn't have to be so distinct, but again, they have a little bit more studying that they've done with in terms of fine and gross motor, I would say, I guess.
Insurance has let them work on fine and gross motor. They don't get rejected.
Oh, man, that's a whole other conversation, right? So we can't work on, cutting and writing, but we can work on buttons and snaps. That's a whole set. I'm sure we'll get to that. And when we circle back to the conversation with Michelle about why she hated being a clinical director, which I'm sure included some of these details. Dan, you've been compiling a whole bunch of questions on this, so I'm going to let you loose.
Okay, yeah, if it looks like I'm looking down, it's me trying to make sure that I don't interrupt, so I can ask you some follow-up questions on my my little notepad here.
Dan is probably the most incredible multitasker with his device that I've ever seen. When we were moderating that conference where we met you at, I was amazed at how he could play with the computer keyboard, do things for us technically on the screen, work with his phone, talk to me on the side, and still pay attention. I don't know how you do that, dude.
No, it's great. I can watch my girlfriend and not listen to anything she's saying at the same time. It's wonderful.
Here we go.
Also, with our new setup, we have this this device with some sound. So Mike's gonna be like a kid at a candy store with sound.
I'll try not to do it too much. I had to do it there to just kind of hallmark the moment. Whenever Dan talks about not his girlfriend, his domestic partner.
Anyway.
I like to make sure I got to razz him a little bit. Anyway, without further ado, sir, I'm sorry I interrupted.
No worries. I'm gonna go in chronological order, kind of what you were talking about. So. Initially, you were saying there wasn't really ABA, but your parents got like a parent training, almost like an ABA autism coach. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah. So the parent training, so keep in mind the BCBA credential did not come out until towards the end of the 1990s. It was like 1999-ish, I believe, or like 2000. And I was getting ABA in 1995. So when you think about ABA back then, an autism coach was very similar to that of a BCBA, except number one, it wasn't called a BCBA. And number two, I have no idea what this autism coach's credentials
That was
were,
my question.
but they were an expert enough in our field. Yeah, they weren't an expert enough in our field. We didn't know that. We didn't know exactly what that looked like. My mom was given these resources. She contacted her and she came out to us. She really only came out to us on a couple different occasions. And keep in mind, when it comes to parent training, at my job, we're supposed to do parent training once a week. This person came out once a quarter to train my mom.
Wow. So 4 times a year?
Go over these goals and go over things that,
Wow.
she's supposed to do. Yeah. And yeah, not very often at all. But it's so funny because in today's world, at my job right now, we're required to do it once a week. At previous jobs, I had to do it at least once a month. So to see that is kind of amazing to me,
Wow.
But yeah, they came in, they worked with my mom, they worked with me, and really like my mom was considered the behavior technician or the RBT,
Sure.
working with me. So she would work on these goals. I think somewhere in my like many different things in my house, there should be a VHS of me actually within an ABA session that my mom was running. And there have been times where I've watched it and I've just laughed at myself because I was a cute little 3-year-old at the time. I think I was 3 or 4 years old during all of this. And I was like, you know what? I really love this. It was so cute. So yeah, no, that's what we ran into in the 1990s. There really wasn't a whole lot about ABA back then. And also too, ABA wasn't covered by insurance back then either. So it wasn't like we had the proper resources. Like everything came out of my mom's pocket. Everything came out of, just the fact that, this person came in for us twice a year or 4 times a year, once every quarter. It's just it's crazy. It's crazy to even think about. So
That is nuts. I know we also run a company, Ascend Behavioral Solutions, and we are huge on the parent training model. So I'm sure later we'll talk about kind of how it has changed from the parent training model. It sounds like even initially to more of an RBT direct service, kind of what that looks like. But yeah, parent training is so important. I do have a question for you though. So that all stemmed from your diagnosis you mentioned of PDD-NOS. Did your mom reach out to these people? And if it's getting too personal, let me know and we can not talk about it. Did your mom reach out to these people because you had that diagnosis and she was just unsure of what that meant? Or did your mom reach out to those people because you were having some behavioral challenges or challenges that she wasn't sure how to address at that time?
I think it was a combination of both.
Okay.
My mom was like, when she got the diagnosis for me, she was like, great, what's next? She wasn't one of those parents who was like, really upset in denial. Like my mom was like, thank God there's finally something. Now, what do I do?
Yeah.
And, my mom did see these things and was like, I need to reach out to somebody. I need to reach out to anybody who can help my daughter. And so that's exactly what my mom did. So
Were these might have been like university-based individuals or students, maybe? Is that maybe what? Because that's pretty early on in terms of, I can imagine a lot of this being proliferated more through that university research center kind of thing, especially if they're seeing you once a quarter. So as you think about that, were these long sessions? Would they come and see your mom for like an extended period of time, a couple days or a couple of hours?
No, it was more like a couple of hours. And
kudos to your mom. She did a lot of work.
Yeah, she did. She really did. Yeah, between that, my mom also hired like babysitters to come in and do a little bit of this work with me. I forgot to mention that when I was first talking about my story. But there were these people who would come in, they were like my babysitters. And my mom was kind of like teaching them the certain goals that I was working on. And these sitters would really try. We call them sitters because that's what like we called them in my house. They were basically the equivalent of a technician. And basically, they had no experience. They didn't know what working with an autistic person was really truly like. And so they came in and my mom would teach them things and they would teach me things. And of course I had my own separate behaviors that I would engage in. Like I remember my mom telling me about a time where I took a person's keys and handed it back to them and said bye because they would not stop placing demands on me. I was like, get out of my house. But then that same day, that person was staying over for dinner. Keep in mind, BACB didn't exist. There was nothing about ethics back then.
Sure.
And so I was proud to make the dinner table. Like I was proud to set up the plates, the forks, the napkins. I was proud to give them over that the necessary items. And apparently the sitter goes, wait a minute, why is she so happy to do this? And my mom's like, because it's a preferred activity for her. You telling her what to do with the prepositions, I think that specific direction was like, following directions using prepositions was aversive for me, where setting the table was highly reinforcing. So of course I was going to follow that reinforcing direction.
Yep.
So
when your experience is interesting because it seems like you, for the most part, outside of putting that person's keys and handing them and asking them to leave, had a fairly positive experience. And please correct me if you feel differently. One of the episodes that we did was on Chloe Everett. She's a individual with autism, and she had a very kind of negative, looking back retrospect on ABA and, people coming and just barking orders at her and saying that in hindsight, she wishes she wouldn't have had it done. So I guess my question to you is along those lines. Do you have any thoughts on, well, number one, would you say that your experience was positive, maybe productive? And number two, do you have any thoughts on how your experience may compare to other people's experiences and whether it's ABA as a field or maybe the way that people are providing it that's the culprit?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on that. So
Please
first,
do.
I will say that I think my experience was positive, but I think my experience was positive because I had a very forthcoming mother who was going to fight literally tooth and nail to make sure that I was going to get what I needed. My mom did not want to have a provider to just come in and, just be lazy or, be non-compassionate. My mom knew what she wanted basically for me to be where I am right now. So for me, I feel like, hearing all of the different experiences from autistic people who have been through ABA, my experience is rare. And that's really unfortunate to hear. It is unfortunately, something that I hear a lot in the field about how, ABA is abuse. And the thing is, I think it really is dependent on the provider. It is dependent on, who you're working with. I do think that, certain companies that are private equity backed have more likelihood to be more on the abusive side because all they care about is the money and they're not caring about like the employees, the compassion, the ascent, sort of like building skills from a socially significant point of view, but rather, this is a client, they're 30 hours a week. I can come in and work with them. This is a guaranteed paycheck. That's what I feel like is happening. And unfortunately, ABA has had a pretty rough history. There is history of the spank, there is history of the shock. And, there's a lot of things behind that make our field sort of have this bad name. And because of that, I can see why there are so many autistic people and their family members, be against ABA. So that being said, I will always uplift those voices. I listen to those voices.
Sure.
I'm never going to, you know, reject those voices at all, because at the end of the day, this is a service that is supposed to be beneficial for people. But if it's not beneficial, we need to figure out where we as BCBAs, we as providers, and we as an entire field need to actually like fix and do our part. Our field is never going to be perfect. Our field is never going to be 100% scot-free, just like any other medically necessary service, might I add, because not every medical provider, not every single medically necessary service is perfect, but we can at least gain, traction and do things that can ultimately help us do better in our field. And if we listen and we actually apply the feedback, then who knows, maybe we can be a more compassionate ABA.
Compassion is an interesting word, and I think it's a very useful term to analyze at this point in time because you can take someone like myself who's near 30 years of in and around some sort of developmental ABA practice, and I can think back even 15 years and think of some of the things that were being that we had as part of our training or that we were teaching BIs or the RBTs back then to do. And, a lot of those things will make me cringe now. I'm like, ooh, I can't believe that's what we were doing, right? And it's interesting because I don't, and I'm not pushing back on anything you said. That's why I want to talk about the idea of compassion, because it's so difficult to feel like at that point in time I wasn't driven by compassion, but at the same time, if I look at the practices that I wasn't fully questioning before I implemented them, before I educated myself further, then that's when I really cringe and go, ooh, I'm so glad I've got different approaches. And I love the nuance in the examples you gave. The idea that we could take a child handing us our keys and saying bye-bye, and we could read the function as a sort of escaping from demands or escaping non-preferred activities. Okay, that's fine. But they also just said farewell. That's a good data point, isn't it? They also just mandated for you to stop doing whatever it was you were doing that made them say, hey, get out of here. I don't like what you're doing. So
self-advocacy.
I think self-advocacy, exactly. It's a real fine line between non-compliance, negation, and self-advocacy. And so I love those examples you're giving, or the one with the prepositions versus setting the table. Well, can't we work on prepositions while we set the table? Yes, we can. And I think a lot of these things become and it becomes a matter of, again, without trying to pinpoint all the variables. And again, I want to talk, this is all under the guise of compassion. Whether it's the way we train, how fast we're meeting the demand, you can miss a lot in how we educate our younger professionals who are carrying these things out. And if you're not careful, you end up with this laundry list of linear programs and contingencies that, if applied blindly, are going to lead to some level of non-compliance. And then we might sit there diligently with our behavior data saying, oh, well, they tantrum for 45 minutes. Well, right, what was the antecedent, truly? Right? And what part did you play in that antecedent? Could you have preempted that tantrum and then saved yourself 45 minutes for instruction and play and the practice, practicing the behaviors that are going to prove more socially significant, perhaps. So I said a lot there. I'm going to let you guys unpack it.
Yeah. Oh, I have a straight up example.
Please do.
Of when I was a technician. I remember I was coming in and I was actually taking over for a technician, and they had already been in, I believe, a like 30-minute back and forth of just getting them to say a specific word. And we were an pro-escape extinction clinic. So everything we did, we had to follow through with the demand in place. And I was a technician, so I had my hands behind my back. I couldn't say like, this isn't working, can we try something else? And I couldn't like also say, hey, I don't agree with this, because I could have easily lost my job at that point. I could have easily gotten in trouble at that point. And I know I'm overreacting. I know I'm like over exaggerating here. But that being said, like I was so afraid of that back then. And so the technician that I was covering for, she was like, hey, by the way, so we're trying to get her to say this one specific word. And she's been hitting me because I've been, saying that. And it's like, okay. So then I come in and I'm doing the same thing. And I'm going at this for another 30 minutes. And thankfully her BCBA walked by around the 30-minute mark. And I'm like, I'm looking at her and I'm like, this isn't working. Like I was kind of like gesturing to that. and like saying, I need help. And so she goes right in, she gives a specific, I think she did like first then with her, which at that point I was not instructed to do that. I was instructed to just do escape extinction. And I'm just like, I can't even ask about motivation. I can't even ask about, I can't ask what she wants to do. I can't have her advocate for herself. Again, my hands were tied as a technician. That's a time where I honestly felt like, and looking back, I cringe because it's like, I really should not have done that at all. And I've been in clinics where, it's been pro escape extinction. You have to stand up. You have to repeat the SC over and over and over again. And it's like, this isn't effective. This isn't working. We need to figure out how we can reach these children. If we want our kids to be able to listen to us, we need to do our part and listen to them, listen to their body, listen to what they need. Not just you listen to me, because at that point it just becomes a power struggle, and no one wants to deal with a power struggle.
And then you wonder why the abuse rate is so high for a lot of the neurodivergent and people of that arc, is because they're used to being told that their self-avocation is, they need to follow and they need to comply.
Yeah.
Which is something that obviously we've talked about a lot. And, we may have had a part in, unfortunately, from older school. And I say older school, I put it in quotes because there's a lot of people that still do that today. But go ahead, Mike. No, brain spinning.
No, it just makes me think a lot about, again, the idea of compassion, the notion that, without giving it too much historical context or taking too much time, the notion that you've got a certain percentage of these individuals, we go back to 1970, for example, let's go 68, and you've got, 90% of then childhood schizophrenics, right, before ASD or had a role in the DSM or a term in the DSM, being institutionalized. So then you take that urgency and you apply these more stringent, more traditional ABA techniques to it, and it works. And that gives us our empirical validation to then come into the marketplace. And then to your point, Michelle, clearly our evolution needs to catch up to us, meaning, hey, we've already proven this is effective. How does it need to be replicated so stringently and so experimentally? Or can it now take a form of more social validity, which is what I think you're talking about, which is listen to the client. Yes, if we know that the learning principles are also at play here with this individual that perhaps we've otherwise deemed in the past as unteachable, to use that phrase very poignantly, we proved ourselves wrong. So now if they could learn this way, this child can learn presumably anyway, where there's reinforcement available, right? So again, it's fascinating, and I really appreciate your perspective on it because you've lived it, and you have a whole perspective that I will never have on it in terms of receiving the services. So I really appreciate, I guess, how I'm better understanding this idea of compassion. I think it's going to be a conversation that we're going to have to continue exploring as a field, because to Dan's point, there are a lot of professionals, colleagues that we might talk to about their particular practice approach and be like, you're still doing that? Okay. How's that working for you? And there's like an authoritarianism that, again, I think there's still compassion in that, in this, and I'm going to say it, and I want your perspective on it, this idea that I can fix you. Just let me force you to go through this procedure and I can fix you. And so again, I'm not trying to be overly facetious there, because I think there's a true heart and a true good intent in that. And then I also feel like it turns out poorly most of the time. Go ahead.
Yeah. So first I want to say, like, when it comes to people practicing, kind of the same things, it's so interesting because I actually had a previous supervisee who became a BCBA, and she came up to me and she was like, "You're the first person to ever talk about assent." Ever to me. And I've been in this field for like 5 or 6 years at that point. And I'm like, are you like, and I didn't want to judge the situation. My brain was saying, are you actually serious right now? But then I was like, wow, it's really good to know that, like, you want to do better, but you hadn't been taught to do better because your supervisors taught you, you have to follow through with the demand in place. You have to do this. And it's like, well, the thing is, like, no, like, we need to teach self-advocacy. And so unfortunately, I feel like self-advocacy goals have been, more or less more or less like popularized very recently, as opposed to the beginning of ABA. Why can't we withdraw assent? Why can't we say no? Why can't we deny your instruction?
Super simple
Why?
questions, so important. Yeah.
Exactly. Like, unless it is a safety direction, unless my child is running across I-95, you should be able to say no, and let's think about it from a different perspective. I remember reading some statistics, and I'm sure that this has changed, but I read somewhere 90% of autistic females will be sexually assaulted in their lifetime. And that is why the power of no is so beyond real. I mean, I talked about this in an episode with Landa Fox, and we were talking about like sexual health and sexual safety. And that's why, like, we have to be able to say no. We have to be able to withdraw assent, because if we're not doing that, we run into the risk of, potentially putting our clients in very dangerous situations. And going back to the fixing portion, first of all, we're not a broken toy.
Absolutely.
Okay, we're not
Absolutely.
a broken toy. That's the first thing that I want to say is we are not a broken toy. We're not a broken electronic. My brain wires very differently from a different person, and all autistic people are very different from each other. There's this saying of like, no two autistic people are alike. It is very factual. Our brain wires very differently from one another. And it's one of those things where it's like, rather than try to fix us, try to help us in a variety of factors. How can I learn a specific skill in a way that is different? Perfect example I can think of is with shoe tying. There are people who are able to tie their shoes doing one loop and then tying around the loop and then putting the loop under.
Two
I've
bunny ears. Two
never
bunny
been
ears.
able. Yeah, I am of the two bunny ear era. So that's how I did. Thank you. That's how I did it. So, if my way of learning is invalid to you, then that speaks to your character more than it speaks to my ability to learn something.
That's funny that you brought that up. We were literally just talking about that, and then I'll pass it right back to you about a handwriting program. Yesterday we were looking at a handwriting program, and you were like, how many people in the world actually probably use the Pintergraph exactly as an OT would do it?
I bet it's less than half. I really do. I mean, I don't know the stat, but to your point, like we, are thinking back about old goals and this idea that we would specify we'll use a tripod grip and it's just like this. And I'm like, I don't even use that grip.
Your shoe tying.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. No. So it's like, it's really funny because we all do things that are very differently. But if the goal is, if the goal is the same, then why should we teach one specific rote modality that probably isn't as successful for them? That's why when I work with technicians, I'm also of the belief that, if I view my technicians like a giant circle and this is like their line of service, they're seeing my kid way more than I am. So they are like this and I am like this little itty bitty circle. And so when they tell me, hey, I think the goal that you have is great, but the way that we have it written might not match how they're learning. I want to show you how I've been able to do this. And I'm like, okay, let me see what you're doing. And they're still getting the same answer. They're still getting the same results. And it's like, okay, I need to change my teaching. I need to be flexible in my thinking. And, if this is how they're learning, then that is just as valid as how I'm teaching it.
Yeah.
And for them, they got it. They can do it. So for me to say, oh, well, my teaching method is the only way, which I could talk a lot about, BCBAs and humbleism, but that being said, I also have seriously gotten to the point where it's like, when it comes to our client's style of learning, I would rather adopt how they learn rather than impose my style of learning, how I grew up, how I learned specific skills, because not everybody learns the same way. Everybody learns in a very different capacity and everybody learns in different types of modalities. Some people learn by watching, some people learn by verbal instruction, written instruction, and some kids just they might learn in a way that I would have never dreamed about. So who am I to say you have to learn it like this and that's it? And if you don't like that, then nope, you don't know the skill.
I think you're
that's
speaking
not right.
a lot to response generalization and response generality, and something we haven't really done in ABA. It's always
so
been...
if you teach something only one way, you might have trouble with generality?
Yes.
That's wow, wait a minute.
And you can only say, what is your address? You can't say, where do you live or where's your house? It has to be a very specific...
So as you guys talk about this, it dawns on me that one of the biggest problems we have, I think even ongoing with, say, RBT training, is that linear singular contingency. And then to your point, Michelle, the notion that there's one activity and one activity only that can teach to this particular target on this goal that is already overly specified in such a way that it leaves zero room for differential reinforcement. It's either going to be positive, and I don't even think the RBTs know how to use negative reinforcement or employ that effectively, but it's always this idea of positive reinforcement, which in and of itself isn't a problem, but becomes a problem likely when it's attached to one particular response for one particular SD that only the RBT can emit. Otherwise, it's not a correct response. So then we have people employing correction procedures to answers that could have otherwise been differentially reinforced. So I've never said that before, never really thought that before, but your perspective completely let me land on that and be like, of course, there's no differentiation. There's very little shaping. We talk about it, but teaching somebody to do that can be a challenge, right? Last thing I'll say too, only because you talked about humility and BCBAs, and are you going to pick up on that?
No, go ahead. You first.
Well, I was just going to make a joke that it's going to be, I think we have to task analyze humility for most of us to. Task analyze humility.
True.
There, here we go.
We're going to do it 80% of opportunities across 10 consecutive sessions.
Otherwise, you're not humble enough.
Bury that. Bury that.
No, I noticed you picked up on that and you mentioned that because my full-time job, I work for ProAct. Are you familiar with ProAct out of curiosity from the residential side of things? Oh, it's a professional assault crisis management company, like a de-escalation. Are you familiar with CPI at all?
Yeah, I'm CPI and Safety Care.
Okay, so it's a competitor that's better than both of them. But we train all sorts of different individuals from group homes to residential to hospital to BCBAs. And the BCBA humbleism is interesting because, I've gone from exclusively in the ABA field to both in and out of it. And it's you don't really realize it when you're in it, but then you step out of it and you're like, whoa, BCBAs do need some humbleism because you get a class with some BCBAs and some people from other fields, and it's just like the BCBAs think they know everything about everything. It's like, whoa.
Well, and if we can posit that...
You passed the test. You passed the test, and you got 4 letters.
Hey, it's a hard test.
New ones. The new ones are the ones that know everything.
Well, the new ones, I mean, there's no experience, right? All your experience goes out the window. They want the same salary. They want everything the same. It's like, wait a minute. Hold on here. Yeah, you're right. You passed the test. Now, in all fairness, I think there's a fervor in that, we want to be the ones that come up with the right answer, and then almost to a fault, which is the point we're making here. You have to collaborate. You have to see that, hey, that OT is getting them to respond. You're not getting them to respond. How's that person doing that? How can you emulate or take from any of that? How can you pair yourself with that person? How can you spend an entire 2 hours just responding to the child's negation? Their man to say, hey, man, get out of my space. And then maybe 2 minutes later, you try respectfully again, right? I mean, I've done that over many times. It's a dance, and it's very difficult, and it can be very humiliating towards then developing a sense of humility and saying, hey, this kid's rejecting me, and yes, maybe the parents like, oh, they don't like you, or all those phrases that make us feel a little bit self-conscious as we're trying things and they're not working. And then at the end of the day, when you get into that flow and you go, hey, this kid's just telling me no, I can honor that. I can reinforce no very easily. In fact, I'll just leave the room for 2 minutes and come back and then see what happens. So I do think we need to get much more creative. I think that these discussions are helping us. I do fear a lot of, colleagues that want to reject. I like the way you said it earlier. We have to listen to these voices. Whether or not I agree with what they're saying, they've got a perspective they're lending. And I need to learn from that and really allow that to help my practice evolve. So.
Yeah, and here's the other thing too. With relation to, listening to the voices. A lot of these voices have been through ABA. So
Very true.
unless you've been through ABA, unless you have been inside of their socks and shoes and body, you do not get to say their experience, is different, or,
Agreed.
their experience was an anomaly from how they're providing, because that's their experience and their experience alone. And, you may provide compassionate services, and I say that in quotations, but you may do that, but you'll never change their mind, because what they went through is what they went through.
That's very well stated. Thank you for saying that. That helps me a ton. And try not to be frustrated with the differing voices, but learn from, listen. And at the end of the day, hey, we agree to disagree if that's where we're at. But I think you said something very important there.
I had one more thing on the compassion piece that maybe I wanted to wrap up, but I want to pass it to you to get the final word on that before we move on to other topics. And you brought up an interesting quote, Mike, the other day about compassionate ABA, and it was like, "What have we been doing?" What was your quote?
So it's not mine. It's a colleague of ours that is very important in the field. Actually, I'll say it. Shout out to CJ, and he's one of those very compassionate, longstanding, giants in the field at this point. From the Kansas program. And, so he gets a little frustrated with those voices, I think. And he'll say, well, compassionate ABA, what have you been practicing? Uncompassionate ABA. And it's like, well, that's an important question. Now, I can look at what he does, and despite it being rooted in very traditional practice, which is where he comes from, right from the roots of it, I can see a lot of compassion, and I don't see him running into those quandaries of, having clients tantrum excessively, or have him be overly forceful or not listen. So I can hear him and say, yeah, I think you've got it. And then with all due respect, I think, to your point, Michelle, there are other people who didn't necessarily get that, even if they were working with somebody who was well-trained, well-educated, back from a more traditional approach. So again, it's a very interesting evolution that we're having here with this idea of compassion. The last thing I'll say is I think that we have to be mindful of our own successes, meaning that if we've made these connections over time across different demographics, the idea of, neurotypical versus neurodivergent, I think that's the important part, is where at one point we didn't see a connection. We saw this huge differentiation enough to even isolate certain folks. Now we are obviously not doing that. There is an aspect of our progress that we need to honor in order to transform our current practice so that it looks, more assent-based, more humanitarian, more mindful of different forms of communication, all of those things that I can go on and on. But you're really lending a lot of perspective, so I appreciate your time and your thoughts.
Here are my thoughts, and then let me pass it to you, Michelle, for the final thoughts. Based on kind of what you were saying, is that compassion, I think, maybe is an interesting word, and maybe we could have. I think that word is triggering almost sometimes, because if we say that we're doing it now, that means we weren't doing it previously, which I think is where people get. I think previously people were doing what they thought was compassionate to the most part. Now, certainly people do get on power trips and struggles and get a little bit too authoritarian, but I think for the most part, people were doing things that they thought were compassionate. However, I think the differentiation comes from kind of what Michelle alluded to, was the difference between previously was kind of like fix this person. This person,
very important.
Again, for lack of better terms, has something that needs to be fixed. And as a result of that, they need to listen to us and they need to do exactly what we said. And if they do that, then they will be on the right track of typicality, whatever that means. And so people are still trying to be compassionate. They were like, well, if this person listens to me, they will be in a better place. Whereas now I think it's less of the idea of fixing this person and how can we work with them. So
Collaborate.
Yeah, maybe the word compassion could be changed because people were probably doing it, but the way that it's delivered, certainly looking at today's standards, would not be considered compassionate.
I'll make a very gross analogy. I'll kind of use the idea of a lobotomy. A frontal lobotomy as a good example. At one point in time, sticking a sharp object up somebody's nose and severing those two connections between their brain hemispheres to stop severe epilepsy was very compassionate practice. It is no longer compassionate practice. We've learned better. And I think that's so for lack of better phrasing, if you're out there still doing frontal lobotomies with an ice pick, there's newer, better methods. And I think that's what we're talking about as BCBAs here, and saying, hey, if anything, what we learned in the lab is that there's a collaboration that can be achieved. To your point, Dan, I think that it was a very unidirectional relationship that we've practiced before, which is now you're better because I can tolerate your behavior based on the changes that I think I incited. Where I think what we're moving toward is, hey, now we're collaborating, and that's the better flow for everybody.
Michelle, thoughts on that?
Oh yeah, I mean, I could definitely talk about that. Even with like you probably heard the term trauma informed,
Sure.
Yep.
trauma
Sure.
assumed. You know, there's a lot of different like ways that we're doing. There's a lot of different ways that, you know, we're trying to do ABA. I definitely can see like that term of compassion being like changed because of that. Because granted, like we came into this field probably with one collective goal, right? Is to help people, you know, live a least restrictive life, to, you know, help them be able to live a life that they want to do. I hope that's what everyone's goal in mind is. But that being said,
Certainly isn't the
you know,
money.
it's yeah, right. It's not about the money.
Go ahead.
No, no, but in all seriousness, you know, the thing is we do need to look at, you know, different perspectives. We do need to collaborate more. One of the other things when it comes to our field having such a rough name is because we're not as collaborative. We think that we are always right. And the thing is, let me tell you how many times I've gotten things wrong a day in my own practice. You know, like we need to look at it. We do need to be humble. We do need to understand that everybody learns differently. Everybody has been through different forms of things in their life. You know, everybody has a different story, and we do need to be more flexible in our thinking and our ways of teaching, and actually try to adapt to them as opposed to they should adapt to a neurotypical standard.
So that brings me to the next kind of transition that I think is very relevant to what you're saying. We did an episode on it, and I'd love to get your opinion on it and you to elaborate on it. And it's the difference. It's actually a parent of a client that we used to work with that brought this up to me, and I wasn't really aware of this before she brought it up. And it's the social versus the medical model of disability. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that differentiation.
It's pretty familiar, yeah.
The social meaning it's a more of a society thing, and society can work to change, versus the medical model is there's something wrong with you that needs to be fixed, and
Symptoms that need to be addressed. Right?
symptoms. And being that we've been primarily funded by the medical industry, a lot of times ABA either intentionally or unintentionally goes under the medical model of fixing things versus the social model. Do you have any thoughts on kind of how either one or both or a collaboration of those models can be used most effectively in treating ABA? I'm sorry, in treating the people that we work with.
I think that there could be some collaboration between both. I think part of it is like insurance companies. So I work for a company that we use insurance, and we reach out to insurance to get approvals for authorization. And unfortunately, what I have found with like insurance companies is they want to look at the DSM, 5 criteria. They want to look at medical necessity. They want to look at all of these specific like symptoms that are, quote unquote, wrong with our clients.
Deficits.
And I think that, deficits. Exactly. Rather than looking at it from a strengths-based point of view, talking about areas of support that are needed. I think that there could be a lot more work in collaborating, getting insurance to collaborate with people with disabilities, even just to like, talk to them about what disability means to them. What are areas that they need more support with? It's also really like figuring out language too. I know personally speaking, language does matter a lot to me. And so when I say, for example, I don't like the words maladaptive behavior. For me, the word maladaptive behavior assumes that this behavior is just unacceptable in any form of society, where I'd rather say something like target behaviors for reduction, where it's like, okay, if there are specific behaviors that we need to reduce because it is unsafe to the client, it is impacting their ability to live a least restrictive life, then that's the way I want to go, as opposed to this behavior is unacceptable in any capacity. And that also tends to be, like, for example, I still see behaviors about stimming sometimes, and the stimming might be an automatically reinforcing behavior to them, but it's not impacting anybody else. It's just they're stimming.
Yeah.
They're doing it because it helps them enjoy themselves. And so I think there needs to be collaboration in what is, truly what truly needs to be considered when looking at disability as a whole, from a medical standpoint and a social standpoint, and how both can learn from each other and how we can all do better.
A quick question that you just made me think of in terms of stimming and the impact on the environment and sort of that collaboration. What's your stance? I like to talk to parents about, or people in general, the idea that somebody stimming might be annoying to you. That's in and of itself not a reason to make them stop. And then if we're really going to have a collaboration, is there a place for then somebody to say, hey, that's not working for me right now. Can you please stop for now? Do you think that's fair? What's your impression on that?
So I have been somebody who has intervened on stimming before. I will admit that. And it's not really like, it's something that I do have a little bit of shame of. But that being said, I also feel like if I hadn't done that, then I wouldn't be the behavior analyst that I am right now. But that being said, it really just depends on, number one, the topography of stimming. If they're stimming, it's just them flapping their hands and pacing back and forth. Okay. If it's, them stimming and like hurting themselves, then we need to look at shaping that stimming to where they're not harming themselves. Behavior to me, I want to look at how can I work with my client and promote behaviors that will help them lead a least restrictive life, and that being said, and that's ultimately safe for them as well. So for me, when it comes to stimming, I have had conversations with families about what stimming is and kind of like how we can how we can work on stimming, and and what environments we should necessarily like intervene on stimming. For example, I worked on decreasing stimming when it came to completing tasks, because it was impeding their ability to, access a least restrictive school environment. It was also preventing them from being able to make meaningful relationships with other people. And so what we ended up coming up with was, when we're working on, certain like tasks, we might say like, okay, if you need that time, take that time. But right now, when we're at the table, when we are doing this, we are going to use this card. But if you need a break, that doesn't mean that they can't ask for a break. It just means that right now we're doing this. And if you need to take that break, please take it. And so we've designated a time and a place. And, we've also designated to like a specific space in their house, a safe space for a better term, for them to be able to do this. So that way they don't feel like they're judged. And they don't feel like they need to, they can unmask essentially. The other thing with that too is, people who say like, oh, I want to decrease my child's stimming because my child's stimming is annoying and it's loud and it's bothersome. Well, you all technically stim too, right?
Absolutely.
Like, don't you like right now I have this little like pom-pom ball in my hand and I'm like, I'm stretching it out. Is it annoying to you? I want you to, yeah, exactly. So I want you to, put your hands on your bottom. I want you to cross your legs together. I want you to sit completely still. I want you to do that. And I want you to tell me if that feels comfortable to you, or if you feel like you need to move your hands, or if you need to move your body, or if you need to move, something to make you ultimately feel more comfortable. And that's where I feel like the most success has come from that conversation about stimming.
My partner is always fidgeting, and it drives me absolutely crazy. But it happens, and she has the right to do that. Drives me nuts though, but that's okay. People, like you said, people do that.
I bite my thumb when I'm thinking sideways too. It's like I bite my nail, and that's just what I do. And I really love your perspective on that, particularly with the way others might consider the idea of shaming or having somebody feel ashamed because they've got this, call it an impulse, self-soothing impulse, I'll say, if that's fair. And again, we all have it. We all have a way to regulate. And we go back to this concept of normalcy where maybe a lot of us chew on our pens or tap our feet. And then there are other things that seem a little bit more idiosyncratic in certain environments. And the idea that, again, it's going to be an exchange, a collaboration, if I understood you correctly, the idea that I might go to somebody and say, hey, that's a little loud right now and I'm having trouble hearing that. Can you work with me? Versus the idea of you have to stop doing that. That is so annoying. I think it's a nuance, but it's a really important distinction where you're not collaborating with somebody and say, hey, buddy, I actually understand that this probably makes you feel good. If there's any way we can pause for a second to let this happen and then go at it, go tap your foot or do what you need, because the notion that you need to stop something simply because it's annoying to me from a social perspective, that just can't dominate the terrain.
Absolutely. And if I can just say real quick too, people with autism are really like disabled people already deal with enough stigma as is. Don't let this be another thing that we're dealing with stigma for.
Which is so interesting. Like, I mean, we could talk for hours about maybe on another episode, because this would be a long discussion, but it's kind of the crux of what we're saying is, using my girlfriend as an example, right? She stims. It irritates me. She's like, so what? Deal with it. She advocates. We honor it. Whatever. But if she had a diagnosis, all of a sudden now it's like, you need to change.
Now it's a problem.
Now you're advocating. Now we're going to override your self-advocacy because you have autism and I need to tell you how you can act. And now it becomes a thing, which then gets into the whole masking thing that you brought up.
Yeah, back into the symptomology, right? Well, that's a symptom of your disability. Stop that, because otherwise it's an expression of this problem that we don't otherwise want to think about, because that concerns us somehow. Again, really fascinating, because even as I say that, I know that there can be good intent. And then, Michelle, you've taught me a lot today about how the other person might receive that in terms of feeling ashamed of the fact that this is just who I am, and this makes you this irritated or this concerned about me that you have to be authoritarian in how you direct yourself toward me. That's tough. That's a really interesting perspective. I think a really important perspective that I hope I'm communicating semi-effectively, because I know it's really resonating in my head.
I appreciate that.
Question for you, Michelle. So you talked about changing maladaptive, the terminology, and I agree wholeheartedly. The vocabulary and language is super powerful. Changing maladaptive behaviors to target behaviors for reduction. One thing that we've done at our companies, we've actually tried to go away from any behaviors for reduction, because what we found is that as soon as we start targeting behaviors for reduction, that's what people look for and spend all of their time charting how many times they protest, or we're a little lighter, I think, on data than a lot of companies, but some companies will do duration and now you pull out your stopwatch and we're just timing this person's protest. And we're focusing more on the replacement behaviors of okay, they're protesting. Why are they protesting? What do we want them to do instead? And in theory, that's how it was always supposed to be done. But in application, what we found is that as soon as we have that target behavior for reduction, that's what the people are focusing on. And then it goes into then it goes into extinction, because they're doing the behavior we don't want them to do. So now we need to put that on extinction. And while in theory, the replacement behavior should be there, in practice, it's not done. What are your thoughts on that?
And that, your exact point is exactly why there needs to be collaboration with insurance providers and people with disabilities, because yes, we do the same thing. Like, we do the replacement behaviors too, but we have to track behaviors that are technically supposed to be
you have to track at least two,
reduction.
Right? At least two, because every patient's going to have two. Oh, okay. I think they tell us two sometimes anyway.
Good.
Yeah. I believe we get told at least one, and we will get a denial because we'll be told, oh, well, they're not engaging in behavior, so it's not medically necessary. ABA can be used in a lot of different capacities rather than just look at reducing target behaviors and increasing skill acquisition.
Interesting.
That's the only reason why. That is the only reason why. Otherwise, honestly, I would look at everything from replacement behaviors and skill acquisition. It's literally this exact reason why we need to collaborate with insurance providers and stop looking at, the medical model of the DSM-5, where we have to decrease these target behaviors or decrease these behaviors that are socially unacceptable. We need to do better in that capacity as well, because we want to look at, replacing certain behaviors with behaviors that may be safer, that may be socially significant for them. But then also too, we need to look at how we can best work with this client and, sort of go around what they're doing and be able to help them advocate, help them, communicate their wants and needs, help them, reach the level of happiness that they deserve to have. They deserve all the happiness in the world, but how can we help them get towards that happiness? How can we get them towards their end goal rather than our end goal?
You just gave me a topic for a future episode, which is the correlation or the difference between social significance and medical necessity. So the idea that there is a notion out there, thank you, Michelle, the idea that there's a notion out there that unless you have some sort of impactful, high duration, high frequency behavior that's otherwise dangerous, for example, then the services aren't medically necessary. That's interesting. I can see where that can hold true. And then I think what you were saying, Michelle, is that that's not the only reason that people can benefit from, or that these things can be deemed necessary and then benefit the person receiving the service. That's really interesting. I've never thought about it that way, but I think it's a misnomer. It's a misconception that we'll continue working on.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's definitely...
ABA is not just...
Go, please.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, ABA is not just used for autistic clients to work on reducing behaviors. It's used in a lot of different capacities.
Now you're just being blasphemous, Michelle. Come on. Now you're just showing off. Get out of here. Are you sure? Because I know that I'm pretty sure ABA and ASD are mutually they're synonymous. It's the only thing you do, right?
Yeah.
From a medical perspective, for sure. Thank you for saying that. I think that's really important for us to remember, and I think we've got guests lined up that are going to allow us to explore that very notion. So, this concludes part 1 of our interview with Michelle Zeman. Please ensure that you return for part 2, and always analyze responsibly.
ABA on Tap is recorded live and unfiltered. We're done for today. You don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. See you next time.